Apparently, the theme in today's news is that we live in a lurid, insider world of covert action, anonymous attacks, untraceable bad guys, spies, and secret international finagling. 'Tis the season. Today we learned that this is the spy who President Obama thanked and praised yesterday in his address to the nation, even though the president did not name him in that speech.
Cuba today released one of the most important intelligence agents that the United States has ever had in Cuba, and who has been imprisoned for nearly 2 decades. This man, whose sacrifice has been known to only a few, provided America with the information that allowed us to arrest the network of Cuban agents that included the men transferred to Cuba today, as well as other spies in the United States. This man is now safely on our shores.
The president did not say this man's name, but there just aren't that many people in the world who would fit the description that the president gave. It seems like the Spanish-language edition of the Miami Herald newspaper was first to report out that the man who President Obama was talking about and praising in his speech, was flown out of Cuba after nearly 20 years in jail. It seems like the Spanish-language version of the Herald was first to report that that man was this man, Rolando Seraf Trujillo. The Herald sussed his name out first, as far as we can tell, and then a lot of other publications filled in with further reporting, supporting the idea that it was him. And ultimately, U.S. officials confirmed that this is the guy. This is the super spy who President Obama traded for. The man who the U.S. credits with wrapping up not one, not two, but 3 major Cuban spying plots inside the United States. Mr. Seraf apparently worked in the cryptology section of Cuba's Directorate of Intelligence. He was a Cuban national. He worked in the Cuban Intelligence Directorate. He was an expert on the codes that Cuba's spies in the United States used to communicate back home to Havana. For example, one of the things that we know about this woman, Ana Montes, who's described as one of the most damaging spies in American history. One of the things we know about her case is that she specifically used a Toshiba laptop computer to compose the encoded messages that she sent back to her handlers in Havana. When she was sending U.S. secrets back to Cuba, she sent them using this specific laptop. Part of the way the FBI and then ultimately the Pentagon caught her is that they had been tipped off somehow to that specific fact about her, to the fact that this spy, who had access to high-level information inside the Pentagon, was specifically using a Toshiba laptop computer to make those communications back to Cuba. So when the investigators realized they had a mole in the Pentagon, they did old-fashioned detective work to narrow down the list of suspects, right, looking at who had access to the kind of information that was being sent to Cuba. They tried to narrow down the list of suspects. When it came time to pinpoint the actual individual, they were able to do it in part because they got financial records that showed that Ana Montes, senior intelligence official at the Defense Intelligence Agency, Ana Montes had taken out a line of credit at a CompUSA store. And then they were specifically able to figure out that the reason she took out the line of credit at the CompUSA store was to buy a Toshiba laptop computer. They got a warrant. They snuck into her house. They found the Toshiba laptop. They go through it. Bingo, she turns out to be the spy. Now we know that that initial kernel of data that led to her, well, we don't know, but now we connect the dots, right? Somebody working in the intelligence directorate in Cuba, who was an expert in the coded messages that Cuba's spies in the United States used to send American secrets home. That would be the kind of person who might notice a detail like what kind of computer that that spy was using to send home that information. This spy, this super damaging spy, was sending home her messages on a Toshiba laptop. And that information is credited with wrapping up Ana Montes at the Pentagon. This spy is also credited with leads that led to Kendall Myers at the State Department. He spied for Cuba from inside the U.S. State Department for nearly 30 years. This Cuban spy is also, this guy who was just freed from Cuba is also credited with the information that led to a huge network of Cuban spies operating inside the Cuban exile community in South Florida. So he worked in the Cuban Directorate of Intelligence. Cuba apparently caught him, figured out what he was doing in 1995. They convicted him of espionage. Apparently he was committing espionage for the United States. They sentenced him to 25 years. President Obama got him out as of yesterday, and flown to the United States. His family in Cuba spoke to reporters today, saying they have no idea where he is. We are told that he is somewhere in the United States. Nobody has seen him yet publicly. But now we know a lot more about the spies and the subterfuge that led to this big announcement about this big change in Cuban policy yesterday. We also know a lot more about how the deal came together. Apparently, very shortly after he was reelected and started his second term, in early 2013, President Obama personally authorized a new, fresh overture to the Cuban government. At the end of his first term, when Hillary Clinton was leaving as Secretary of State, she apparently had written a memo to the Obama White House suggesting a new effort to try to normalize relations with Cuba and to try to get rid of the embargo. President Obama did start that effort secretly at the very beginning of his second term. But it's interesting. He chose not to go through the State Department. He chose not to go through the sort of proper diplomatic channels in order to make this overture. Instead, what he decided to do was go outside the State Department, outside normal, overt diplomatic channels, and instead, this negotiation happened basically directly from one president's office to another, basically from President Obama's office to Raul Castro's office, presidency to presidency. President Obama tapped these two guys, Ben Rhodes, Deputy National Security Advisor, and Ricardo Zuniga from the National Security Council. And in secret, they were the two who made this overture to the Cuban government and started these talks. They started a weird travel schedule where the two of them would fly to Ottawa or sometimes to Toronto. They flew commercial, so it wouldn't seem like they were there doing any official government business. Cuban officials from their president's office would then also fly up to Canada in a low-profile, super-secret way to engage in these meetings. The Canadian government hosted 7 of these meetings. And again, further interest here. I mean, the Canadians were hosting all of these talks. They were having them happen on Canadian soil. They were helping keep them secret. But the Canadian government itself did not participate in the talks at all. So it was in Canada, but it was just the U.S. and Cuba, a very small number of very high-ranking presidential advisors on each side. The only other entity that was involved at all was the Pope. President Obama, you might remember, he went to the Vatican to meet with Pope Francis last March. Apparently, one of the things they talked about there in some detail was the American relationship with Cuba. The New York Times describes it today as President Obama briefing Pope Francis, quote, in a one-on-one meeting over a spare desk adorned with a gold crucifix at the Vatican. So the Pope apparently followed up this one-on-one briefing from President Obama with personal letters that he wrote both to the White House and to Raul Castro, asking both men to keep pushing to get their governments to come to some kind of agreement. Meanwhile, the two sides, the two negotiators, kept secretly meeting in Canada over this year-and-a-half-long effort. Finally, the deal about swapping the spies and freeing Alan Gross, this USAID guy who'd been in jail in Cuba since 2009. The final deal on the spy swap and the prisoner releases happened at the Vatican just 2 months ago. It happened in October. They apparently had one more logistics meeting thereafter in Canada to plan the nitty-gritty, including the exact flight schedules and how they would choreograph the handoff of the spies. But once the deal was settled on, once the deal was arranged, it was 2 days after the midterms when President Obama convened a National Security Council meeting at the White House so the National Security Council could get briefed on the deal and they could sign off on it. That was November 6th when the National Security Council got briefed on what was about to happen with Cuba. And honestly, given Washington, one of the most amazing parts of all of this is that the National Security Council knew about all of this as of November 6th. And here it is, December whatever, and none of it leaked. None of it leaked over the next 6 weeks. It didn't leak, and it worked. And so here are the 3 Cuban spies who we traded to them, meeting with Raul Castro. And somewhere in America right now, apparently, is Rolando Seraf Trujillo, who President Obama described yesterday in his speech. We don't know where in America he is, but he was apparently brought to this country with the president thanking him and singing his praises after he spent nearly 20 years in jail for spying on behalf of this country inside Cuba's intelligence directorate. I know, right?